Marcus Webb had lived his entire life in Millbrook, Vermont, a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. At 63 years old, he was known as the quiet widower who kept to himself after losing his wife Sarah to cancer 5 years ago. His modest house sat on the edge of town, with 3 acres of land that had become his sanctuary and his torment. Every morning at dawn, Marcus would walk through his property with a cup of black coffee, watching the sun rise over the green mountains. The land was good, the soil rich with decades of careful tending. But lately, everything felt wrong. The garden that once fed his family now barely produced enough to fill a basket. He tried everything the Agricultural Extension Office recommended. Synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, rotating crops according to the manual. Nothing worked anymore. His neighbor, Bill Hendricks, owned the farm next door. Bill was everything Marcus wasn't. Loud, successful, and always ready with advice nobody asked for. Bill's farm sprawled over 50 acres, with industrial greenhouses and tractors that cost more than most people's houses. He supplied half the supermarkets in the county and never let anyone forget it. One April morning, Bill leaned against his fence watching Marcus dig in his garden. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of thawed earth. "You're wasting your time with that organic nonsense," Bill called out. "My yields are up 30% this year. You know what the secret is? Science. Real fertilizers. Not this hippie composting stuff you're doing." Marcus didn't look up. He just kept turning the soil, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "I've been farming this land for 40 years, Bill continued, warming to his subject. "You want my advice? There's a reason the big operations do things the way they do. Your little backyard garden can't compete with modern methods." Marcus finally straightened up, his back protesting. "I'm not trying to compete with anyone, Bill. I'm just trying to grow food the way Sarah and I always did." Bill shook his head with exaggerated pity. "Yeah, well, Sarah was a sweet woman, but she wasn't a farmer. You need to move with the times, Marcus. That dirt of yours is exhausted. You need chemicals to put the nutrients back in." Over the following weeks, other neighbors joined in the commentary. At the hardware store, Tom Peterson saw Marcus buying seeds and laughed. "Heard you're still trying to grow vegetables without any help. That's like trying to drive a car without gas, Marcus. Not gonna happen." At the diner on Main Street, where Marcus occasionally ate breakfast, the waitress Linda would shake her head sympathetically. "You should really listen to Bill," she'd say while pouring coffee. "He knows what he's talking about. His farm is doing so well." Even the young couple who'd recently moved in across the street, the Johnsons, seemed puzzled by Marcus's methods. They'd started a small garden of their own, following online tutorials and buying every product the garden center sold. When they saw Marcus's approach, Emma Johnson couldn't hide her confusion. "Mr. Webb," she asked one afternoon, "why are you planting your tomatoes so far apart? And why are you putting them in the ground so late? Everyone else planted weeks ago." Marcus smiled patiently. "Different timing, different spacing. Just trying something new." "But it looks so empty," her husband David added. "And you're not using any fertilizer? How do you expect anything to grow?" Marcus had discovered something during his long, lonely winter. Unable to sleep, he'd spent months reading everything he could find about traditional farming methods, indigenous agriculture, and permaculture. He'd stumbled upon forgotten techniques from the 1800s, methods that farmers used before industrial agriculture changed everything. He'd read about companion planting patterns that seemed counterintuitive to modern thinking. He'd learned about soil fungi networks that fertilizers actually destroyed. The more he read, the more he realized that everything he'd been taught in the last 20 years was backwards. So Marcus made a decision. He would plant his garden completely differently this year. He would ignore every modern rule. He would space plants in patterns that seemed wasteful to conventional wisdom. He would plant cold-weather crops late and warm-weather crops early. He would mix vegetables that were supposed to be kept separate. He would let weeds grow in strategic places. He would never touch a fertilizer bottle. When Bill saw Marcus's garden in late May, he actually stopped his truck and got out for a closer look. "What in the hell are you doing, Marcus? This looks insane." You've got corn next to beans next to squash all in the same bed. That's amateur hour. And look at all this empty space. You're wasting half your garden. Marcus continued watering, letting the criticism wash over him like rain. Bill folded his arms across his chest. You know what? Fine. Do it your way. But when fall comes and you've got nothing to show for it, don't come crying to me. My greenhouse is going to produce more tomatoes than your whole property combined. The entire town seemed to be watching Marcus's experiment with a mixture of pity and amusement. At church, people would pat his shoulder sympathetically. At the post office, the clerk would ask how his backwards garden was coming along, barely suppressing a smile. But Marcus kept working. Every morning, every evening, he tended his unusual garden with quiet determination, guided by knowledge that seemed to come from another time. By mid-June, the ridicule had intensified. Marcus's garden looked nothing like the neat, orderly rows that defined successful farming in Millbrook. Where Bill's fields showed uniform green lines of growth, Marcus's plot appeared chaotic, almost wild. Plants grew at different heights, creating an uneven canopy that looked more like a meadow than a vegetable garden. The town's annual garden club meeting became Marcus's public humiliation. Held at the community center, it was supposed to celebrate local growers and share tips for the season. Bill Hendricks arrived with photographs of his impressive greenhouse operation, displaying them proudly on the projector screen. And here's my tomato yield from last month alone, Bill announced, pointing to crates filled with perfect red fruits. Thanks to my fertilization schedule and pest control program, I'm projecting a 200% increase over last year. The 40 people in attendance applauded enthusiastically. Bill soaked it in. Then his eyes found Marcus sitting quietly in the back row. Marcus, why don't you come up and share what you're doing this year? I think everyone would be curious to hear about your experimental approach. The room fell silent. Marcus felt every eye turn toward him. He shook his head slightly, but Bill persisted. Come on, don't be shy. You've been doing something really different. Very unconventional. I think people should know about it. Reluctantly, Marcus walked to the front. He had no photographs, no presentation prepared. He simply stood there, a weathered man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, facing a room full of skeptical faces. I'm trying some older methods, he began quietly. Companion planting, natural pest management, building soil health without chemicals. Without fertilizers. Someone called out. How do you expect anything to grow? The native plants managed fine for thousands of years, Marcus replied. Bill laughed loudly. Native plants? Marcus, we're not growing prairie grass here. We're trying to produce food. Real food in quantities that matter. Several people chuckled. Marcus felt his face flush. I just think maybe we've forgotten some things that used to work, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. What we've forgotten, Bill interrupted, is what it's like to starve. Modern agriculture feeds the world. Marcus, your little experiment is a luxury you can afford because the rest of us are doing the real work. The meeting moved on, but the damage was done. As people filed out afterward, Marcus overheard their conversations. Poor guy, one woman whispered. He's still grieving Sarah. Not thinking straight. Someone should check on him, another added. That garden of his looks like he just stopped caring. Walking home that evening through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Marcus felt the weight of their judgment. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was foolish, clinging to outdated ideas while the world moved forward. His garden did look strange, unkempt, backwards. But something deep inside him refused to give up. July arrived with scorching heat that baked Vermont harder than anyone could remember. The temperature climbed into the 90s day after day, with no rain in sight. The drought stressed every garden and farm in the county. Bill's fields began to show the strain first. Despite his irrigation systems running constantly, his plants started to wilt. The greenhouse tomatoes developed blossom end rot. His corn stalks turned yellow at the edges. He doubled down on fertilizers, spraying more chemicals to compensate for the stress. Marcus's garden, however, began to transform. The seemingly chaotic arrangement of plants suddenly made sense. The tall sunflowers he'd planted provided afternoon shade for the lettuce below. The squash leaves spread wide, covering the ground and holding moisture in the soil. The deep-rooted plants he'd positioned strategically were pulling water from lower soil layers and sharing it through underground fungal networks with their neighbors. Where Bill's uniform rows created wind tunnels that dried everything out, Marcus's diverse plant heights broke the wind and created microclimates. The weeds he'd allowed to grow in certain spots were actually trapping humidity and preventing evaporation. One morning, Bill drove past and slammed on his brakes. He got out and walked to Marcus's fence, staring in disbelief. Marcus was harvesting vegetables, his baskets filling quickly with cucumbers, beans, and zucchini. "How is this possible?" Bill demanded. "My plants are barely surviving and yours look better than ever. What chemicals are you using?" Marcus straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "No chemicals, Bill. Just water and time." "That's impossible. You can't get yields like that without fertilizer." "Not in this heat." But Marcus was. And it wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The diversity he'd planted created a system that supported itself. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil for the corn. The marigolds repelled pests that were devastating other gardens. The companion planting he'd been ridiculed for was working exactly as the old books had promised. News spread quickly through Millbrook. People started driving by Marcus's property, slowing down to look. The same neighbors who'd mocked him now stood at his fence asking questions. Emma Johnson appeared one afternoon with her phone out, taking photos. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "your garden is incredible. Everything we planted is dying, but yours is exploding. Would you teach us?" For the first time in months, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Maybe he wasn't crazy after all. If you're curious about how this story ends, and want to see what happens when the whole town discovers the truth, take a moment to subscribe. Marcus's journey is just beginning, and the fall harvest is going to shock everyone. The transformation was undeniable now. What had been planted backwards was growing forward with a force that defied everything modern agriculture claimed to know. By August, Marcus's garden had become the talk of the county. What started as curious neighbors stopping by had turned into something bigger. People from neighboring towns drove to Millbrook just to see the garden that thrived without fertilizers while everything else struggled. Marcus began hosting informal tours on Saturday mornings. He'd walk small groups through his 3 acres, explaining the principles he'd rediscovered. He spoke about the Three Sisters method used by Native Americans, planting corn, beans, and squash together in symbiotic relationships. He showed them how certain plants acted as natural pest repellents, eliminating the need for chemicals. He dug into the soil to reveal the rich, living ecosystem of worms and beneficial fungi that his methods had cultivated. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, sent a reporter. The article ran on the front page with the headline, "Local Farmers' Backwards Methods Produce Forward Results." Bill Hendricks read that article 3 times, each reading making him angrier. His farm, once the pride of the county, was struggling. He'd spent thousands on fertilizers and pesticides, yet his yields were down 40%. His soil had become hard and lifeless, requiring more and more chemicals just to produce anything at all. Meanwhile, Marcus was harvesting vegetables daily, filling crates that he donated to the local food bank and sold at the farmers market for modest prices. The Agricultural Extension Office called Marcus in September. Dr. Patricia Chen, the county agricultural specialist, wanted to see his operation firsthand. She arrived with 2 colleagues and soil testing equipment. They spent 4 hours examining everything. Dr. Chen crouched in the garden, running soil through her fingers, her expression changing from skepticism to amazement. "Mr. Webb," she said finally, "your soil biology is off the charts. The microbial activity here is 10 times what we see in conventional farms. The nutrient density is extraordinary, and you're achieving this without any synthetic inputs." She stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. "We've been teaching farmers the wrong methods. You've proven that." The vindication felt surreal to Marcus. For months, he'd endured mockery and doubt. Now, scientists were validating what he'd discovered in those long, lonely nights of reading forgotten agricultural wisdom. The climax came in late September at the county fair. Every year, farmers displayed their best produce, competing for blue ribbons and recognition. Bill Hendricks had won the grand prize for 5 consecutive years. This year, Marcus entered for the first time since Sarah died. When the judges examined his tomatoes, cucumbers, and squash, they found produce that was larger, more flavorful, and more nutrient-dense than anything else submitted. His vegetables hadn't just grown. They'd flourished with a vitality that came from healthy soil, not chemical force-feeding. Bill stood nearby, watching the judges place blue ribbon after blue ribbon on Marcus's table. His face reddened, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The announcement came over the loudspeaker. Grand prize winner, Marcus Webb, for exceptional quality and innovative sustainable methods. The days following the county fair brought a flood of visitors to Marcus's property. Farmers from across Vermont and neighboring states knocked on his door, wanting to learn his methods. He welcomed them all, sharing everything he discovered without hesitation or charge. Bill Hendricks didn't come. For 3 weeks, Marcus noticed his neighbor's absence. Bill's farm had gone quiet. The tractors sat idle. The greenhouse doors remained closed. Then, on a cool October morning, Marcus saw Bill standing at the fence line, just watching. Marcus walked over slowly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one through the fence. Bill took it without speaking. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching leaves fall from the maple trees that bordered their properties. "I was wrong," Bill said finally, his voice rough. "About everything. I watched my farm die this year while yours exploded. I've been farming 50 acres for 40 years and you just taught me I don't know anything." Marcus sipped his coffee. "You know plenty, Bill. You just got sold a different story than the one that's true. I put everything into chemicals," Bill continued. "Tens of thousands of dollars. And my soil is dead now. Completely dead. Nothing will grow without dumping more money into it. It's a trap I built myself." "Can heal," Marcus said quietly. "Soil wants to be alive. You just have to let it." Bill looked at him directly for the first time. "Would you teach me? I know I don't deserve it after how I treated you, but I'm asking anyway." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Come by tomorrow morning. Bring a notebook." Over the following month, Bill became Marcus's most dedicated student. The loud, arrogant farmer transformed into a humble learner, asking questions and taking careful notes. He began converting sections of his farm, reducing chemicals and introducing companion planting. The town of Millbrook watched this transformation with fascination. The rivalry that had defined the 2 farms dissolved into collaboration. Other farmers joined them, forming what they called the Millbrook Regenerative Agriculture Cooperative. Emma and David Johnson became regular helpers in Marcus's garden, learning alongside Bill. The young couple documented everything, creating online videos that reached thousands of people searching for alternatives to industrial farming. By late October, as Marcus prepared his garden for winter, he realized something profound had shifted. The loneliness that had consumed him since Sarah's death had lifted. His property was alive again, not just with plants but with purpose and community. He'd started this journey thinking he was just trying to grow vegetables. Instead, he'd sparked a quiet revolution in how people thought about their relationship with the land. One evening, standing in his garden at sunset, Marcus felt Sarah's presence more clearly than he had in years. She would have loved seeing the town come together like this. She would have been proud that their little piece of land had taught so many people what was possible when you worked with nature instead of against it. 2 years later, Millbrook looked different. What started with one backwards garden had transformed the entire region. Driving through town now, you'd see diverse, thriving gardens instead of uniform rows. The chemical smell that used to hang over the valley during spraying season had disappeared. The farmers' market had tripled in size, with waiting lists for vendor spots. Marcus Webb, now 65, stood at the podium of the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Conference in Burlington. 300 farmers filled the auditorium, hanging on his every word. The quiet widower who'd once been mocked at a small-town garden club meeting was now keynoting regional conferences. But the real change happened back home. Bill Hendricks had converted his entire 50-acre farm to regenerative methods. His yields had dropped initially, as expected during the transition, but by the second year they'd rebounded to match his chemical-dependent production. By year 3, he was exceeding it. More importantly, his operating costs had plummeted. He was spending 70% less on inputs while producing healthier food and rebuilding his soil. The Millbrook Regenerative Agriculture Cooperative had grown to 47 member farms. They'd established a seed library, preserving heirloom varieties. They'd created apprenticeship programs for young farmers. They'd started supplying restaurants and schools throughout Vermont with produce grown using the methods Marcus had championed. Emma and David Johnson had quit their corporate jobs and bought 10 acres outside town. Their online platform, Backwards Farming, had accumulated over 200,000 followers. They credited Marcus in every video, always pointing back to that first conversation over his fence. The Agricultural Extension Office had revised its recommendations, incorporating traditional ecological knowledge alongside modern science. Dr. Patricia Chen had co-authored 3 papers with Marcus about soil biology and companion planting, published in peer-reviewed journals. On a crisp November morning, Marcus stood in his garden one final time before winter settled in completely. The land was peaceful, resting, preparing for spring. He thought about the journey, about how close he'd come to giving up when everyone said he was wrong. Sometimes the old ways aren't backwards, he thought. Sometimes they're just waiting to be remembered. His phone buzzed. A message from a farmer in Oregon who'd read about his methods and wanted to visit next spring. Then another from a university professor requesting an interview. Then one from Bill, asking if he wanted to grab coffee at the diner. Marcus smiled and pocketed his phone. He had vegetables to bring to the food bank, seeds to organize for spring, and a town full of friends who'd learned, alongside him, that nature had been right all along.